Good evening. Good evening, folks. Thank you so much for joining us. So, I have to tell you something though. The foxes are guarding the hen house right now. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with that old saying, foxes eat chickens, they are not guardians, and they are threatening society. Local news reporting safeguards citizens. It's essential to democracy. Did you know that a local weekly newspaper on Long Island, New York, the North Shore Leader, broke the news that George Santos was a fraud? I didn't know that. They ran a series of articles detailing his lies months before the election, and they refused to endorse him. This 20,000 circulation weekly paper did its job. So what happened? According to a follow-up article in the Leader, quoting the Washington Post, it said, a hyper-local outlet like the Leader does the legwork. Regional papers verify and amplify the story. And before long, an emerging political scandal is being broadcast coast to coast. But that system, which is atrophied for decades amid the destruction of news economy, appears to have failed completely this time. We know there aren't enough qualified reporters working now. Over 2,200 newspapers have closed since the year 2000. We've lost 360 just since 2020. Our Zoom tonight is in support of local news. InDepthNH.org is a watchdog news website. Our news coverage focuses on government and public servants. The Lori List is an example of our watchdog reporting. The Lori List, if you don't know what it is a secret list that contains the name of law enforcement officers in New Hampshire who have a history of dishonesty, excessive force, or mental instability. And now I want you to imagine if there was a Lori List for the Minneapolis Police Department where Derek Chauvin was on its roster. He had 18 complaints on his official record. Who knew? Who was watching him? In Depth, New Hampshire is watching for you. The Poynter Institute, in a November 16 article, said over half of the counties in the United States now have just one or none, zero local news outlets. Imagine half of the counties in the United States do not have a local news outlet. The foxes are their guardians in those counties. So let's talk about this tonight with our two amazing guests who are fierce defenders of local news. In 2012, Alice Dreger founded the East Lansing Info, an innovative, nonpartisan, nonprofit, hyper-local news service. That organization is now recognized nationally as a model for how citizens dedicated to the core values of serious journalism can come together to bring themselves accurate, nonpartisan, meaningful community and watchdog news. Dreger's best-known book is Galileo's Middle Finger, Heretics, Activists, and One Scholar's Search for Justice. And might I add, one of the best headlines I've ever read. This argues that the pursuit of evidence is the most important ethical imperative of our time. The most important ethical imperative. I say welcome, Alice Dreger.
Thank you, Beverly.
Nancy West founded the nonprofit New Hampshire Center for Public Interest Journalism in April of 2015. She is the publisher and executive editor of InDepthNH.org that I write for. With many awards and 30 years at the New Hampshire Union Leader, she is passionate about government transparency. And I've been a witness. Amen, Nancy, you are. Nancy was the recipient of the Michael Donahue Freedom of Information Award given by the New England First Amendment Coalition on June 1st, 2023. Welcome, Nancy.
Glad to be here.
Thank you, Nancy. So what's on tap for tonight? We only have an hour. So first, our guests are going to speak 8 minutes or so each about what's going on in local news. And Alice, you can share with them where you are calling in from and how we can save it and what you can do to help. And then after that, I'm going to have some questions for the panel. And finally, we're going to leave the last 20 minutes or so for questions from the audience. And so we're asking all the audience members to please submit your questions through the chat. So, and let us begin. And Alice, we're going to start with you. And would you be so kind to tell us about your work?
Sure, Beverly. Thanks so much for having me. This is a real privilege. Nancy and I have known each other through the networks, the national networks, for several years, and I just love the work that she brings through In Depth New Hampshire. So I'm calling in tonight from Chicago, Illinois, where I've been doing interviews for a new book about local news, but normally I live on the other side of Lake Michigan, which is East Lansing, Michigan. Some of you may know it as the home of Michigan State University, which has one scandal after another in the news. We don't cover Michigan State University. I specifically set up my organization, which we call ELI, for the 20,000 year-round residents who live in East Lansing, Michigan. We are a minority of the population in terms of the sheer number, because we are swamped by 50,000 students who go to Michigan State University, 30,000 of whom live in our city. And the city has a budget that is about 1/400th of the size of the universities. So I felt we needed a news organization to defend us in terms of the experience of living in our city. And I was really motivated by three specific things. I had been doing national work, national investigative work myself. I was publishing in places, mostly op-eds in places like the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal, but also doing investigative health journalism research and historical work as well. And what I saw going into the 2000s was that the journalists that I had been working for years with in health sciences nationally were disappearing. And the reason was the economy had begun to fall out of investigative journalism. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that and what happened with that. And when I began attending my own city council in East Lansing, which I did because a developer was planning to build a giant project down the street from my house, what I realized was that we had a one-party government. Our government is very far left, blue. It's a typical college town in America. And I am politically progressive myself, but I was horrified to realize that there was so much stuff going on that I thought that if the people of East Lansing knew what was happening, that they would be quite shocked. For example, we had a pension debt of about $200 million that was going to have to be carried by the 20,000 of us who live there year round. And then in addition to that, we had a utility that was owned by the city next door, the city of Lansing, that I didn't realize until we had a major outage was not regulated by the state utility regulation system, because it was owned by a city and not by a private company. And so we were left in the dark, literally, with no news organizations to help us get out of this really problematic situation. I ended up being part of a protest to try to attract the news, to try to shine a light on the fact that we were in the dark for 10 days in the middle of winter with our pipes freezing. And then there was that development project where I knew that this developer had a history of problems with developments. He ultimately, by the way, sued me. He's now in federal prison for tax evasion in West Virginia. So that's a story in and of itself. He lost the lawsuit against us. The court dismissed it as meritless. So that all brought me to an interest of trying to bring factual information news to the people of East Lansing. And we did that, and we slowly grew over the years and became a 501c3 nonprofit like In Depth NH to bring donations in and then turn those donations into news. So the difference between what we're doing and what traditional news operations did, traditional news operations were for-profit corporations. And I want to make clear, there's nothing wrong with that. For-profit news can be very high quality news. But as a corporation seeks to make money off of a news organization, what happens is they're bringing in readers to basically turn out ads mostly in order to generate revenue to keep money. And what we're doing is something really radically different, which is we're trying to produce public service journalism that will bring in just enough money to keep the whole system going. So we're not seeking any kind of capital buildup. What we're seeking is to keep taking money and turning it into news as quickly as we can in terms of high quality news. What happened in America in terms of this news collapse? Well, historically speaking, news organizations largely survived on advertising and subscription dollars. And the reason that you could do that is because if you had a physical newspaper, in order for somebody to get a hold of it, they typically had to pay to get it, whether that was at the newsstand or that was through a mail subscription system or not mail, but a delivery system where a news delivery person would come and give you your mail. The other thing that was happening was news organizations would use readers to generate revenue through ads. So you might recall in the newspapers, there were advertisements for the local department store. There were advertisements for the local bar or restaurant, all these kinds of advertisements for the local car sales organization. So all these advertisements would happen. And the news people had, in some ways, kind of a lock because they had a way of reaching you for the advertisers. What happened then was, of course, that the internet came around, and we had a system whereby it suddenly became much easier for people to advertise through the internet. The first really big hit in news appears to have been the Craigslist system, where Craigslist was able to encourage people who used to place personal ads, which not only brought in money for the newspaper, but caused people to buy the newspaper because people wanted to be interested in the classifieds and in the personals, all that stuff. And now Craigslist could do it. But over time, Facebook and Google and other organizations figured out ways, again, to grab those ads and to do it in a very high-tech fashion that helped advertisers target their ads very specifically. And those ads began to get pulled farther and farther away from newspapers. And then because news was available online, people were not interested in paying for subscriptions to access their news for the most part. They got used to where they used to pay for their music, right? You used to buy a CD or buy an album. They expected to be able to listen to the music they wanted to listen to for free. They expected the same thing with documentary art, with all sorts of things. They just expected the internet to be free. And so when news organizations were trying to figure out what to do, some of them continued to make their news free, trying to push ads and do it that way. And the ones that created paywalls often failed because people didn't want to go past the paywalls. So what you had was essentially an accidental defunding of the investigative news system and the watchdog news system. And this created a sort of dangerous loop where what happened was the more clicks you could get, the more money you could get and the better you could keep it going. And so the type of news that ended up being favored was the kind of news that is celebrity news. If it bleeds, it leads, kind of gory crime news. These are the sort of things that will generate money. You know, it's much harder to generate money off of serious investigative news like the type In Depth NH is doing, because that's not the kind of thing that's going to drive 1 million clicks. It's the kind of thing that's going to matter to 10,000 people or 50,000 people very deeply, but it's not going to generate 100,000 or 200,000 clicks. And so the whole economy sort of gets twisted and turned upside down and raises this question of how are we going to do it? Just real quickly before I finish, I want to say, why does news matter? Studies show us that in places where people have high quality news, voter turnout is better. Voters are voting in a more educated fashion. We also find that government waste goes down in certain ways, because what happens when you're shining a light on government is people in the government are aware that people are going to see what they're doing. So we see, for example, cities paying lower rates on municipal bonds where there is local news. And when local news fails, the amount they're paying on municipal bonds goes up. There are ways in which our communities get connected through local news that are otherwise simply unconnected. We have a sense of place and a sense of purpose with each other when we have a news organization that draws us all together. So all of this is really important. And what's so important when we bring high quality news is that we do it in a nonpartisan fashion. I know Nancy's going to talk about this. Where I live in Michigan, because it's a swing state, we've seen the infiltration of news organizations that are really funded and fronted. They are fronts for the Democratic Party or the Republican Party that are trying to swing the presidential election in one direction or another. What we're trying to do at East Lansing Info, what Nancy is doing at In Depth NH, we're trying to say it is not up to us to decide who you're going to vote for or how you're going to think about this issue or that issue. We're trying to bring you the facts so that you can make educated decisions, so you can know what's going on in the world around you. And that's what makes this kind of news really, really different and really vitally important.
So how do you know where a website is getting their money? First of all, how did you raise money for your website, for the East Lansing Info? And then is there a way for the regular reader to look at a website and say, oh, I know that this is a Republican or this is a Democrat or it's whatever kind of mouthpiece? Is there a way to tell? First of all, but how did you get your funds for your site?
The way East Lansing Info is funded is almost entirely from readers. And historically speaking, we've gotten over 90% of our funding just from the folks who read us, who are interested in supporting us because they care about the news that we're bringing. And it's very rare for anybody to give us more than about $4,000 individually. In fact, even that level is pretty rare. So the way that East Lansing Info was funded at the beginning is very common. I've seen now meeting other local news organizations. It existed partly on volunteer service. So people such as myself who had the skills to do it and were economically comfortable enough not to have to draw an income from it, were doing it essentially for free part-time on the side. But as these organizations succeed, then they become organizations that really need to pay people to keep the whole system going. So when we got to that point, what we were doing was doing heavy duty fundraising campaigns, just like you guys are doing, to bring in the money. So East Lansing Info currently operates on about $200,000 a year, which sounds like nothing, and it is nothing. We're bringing a whole city's worth of news on very little money. But the reason is because people are very passionate about it and willing to work for less money than they might get otherwise. That's part of how local news is surviving. We also get a little bit of money through the Institute for Nonprofit News Newsmatch system, which is running right now, and In-Depth NH is part of that. That means that if you give, for example, $150 right now, In-Depth NH will actually be able to get $150 from Newsmatch to double your gift. And that does help to some extent. That definitely makes a difference for folks. But getting grants is actually really difficult because a lot of philanthropies don't think of news as something that is a charitable endeavor. Understandably, historically, it was a for-profit endeavor, even if it was a public service. So it can be very hard to get grants. And advertising, it's a great idea, but in practice, it's very difficult to make very much money off of advertising.
And then the way to recognize if a website that you're reading and falling in love with or whatever, how do you know who's supporting it in the background?
So websites should indicate, they should have sponsorship pages that show you where the money is coming from. And if a news organization is part of INN, it's actually required to disclose if people are giving more than $5,000 a year, for example. And it should show where the grants are from. In addition, if it's a nonprofit news organization, it has to file 990 forms if it earns over $50,000 a year. And you can actually look those up at the irs.gov site by looking up nonprofit organizations and seeing where their money is coming from and where their money is going to. It doesn't show you everything, but it shows you a little bit of that. The other thing you can do is independent research. So for example, if there's a statewide organization, a lot of times there'll be a Wikipedia entry, and Wikipedia is quite reliable on this, that will actually tell you the history of where the fundings is coming from. So there's an organization, for example, that was kind of a front for the DNC, it's States Newsroom, which was getting most of its money for a long time from a billionaire who was funding it in order to push the Democratic agenda. Now they've become more upfront about telling people where that money is coming from. But for a long time, they were hiding the money, and that's really problematic.
Well, and I think one of the important things that's coming out of tonight's conversation is that you really should find out who's paying for the news that you're reading.
Absolutely.
And do they have an ulterior motive?
Well, I think just to jump in for a minute.
Yes, Nancy, I'd like you to go right ahead too, please.
Yeah, that's fine and good with the nonprofit news outlets. We have to be much more transparent. We also want to be more transparent. But for profit news outlets, they don't have to say where they're getting their money. We recently, just this week, a new news outlet came into New Hampshire, and it's one of the Courier News Group's I think it's their 10th website in the whole country. And I spoke with them. I gave them a call to see who they are, where they're coming from, where they're getting their money from. And the new website is called Granite Post. It sounds very New Hampshire. We love anything with the word granite in it. And they wouldn't tell me how much their budget is, where their money is coming from. Actually, they answered it kind of interestingly. They sent me an email back saying they had enough. I wish we all had enough money. And but it's for-profit news outlets, so they don't have to tell us where. I was hoping that, you know, goodwill would prevail and they would explain a little bit about what happened. We also have a state's newsroom outlet in New Hampshire called the New Hampshire Bulletin, which has changed a lot from the early days when they were criticized. And they have, you know, developed that's a nonprofit news outlet, but still, since they're managed and owned by a larger group, it's harder to get really good information from them, except that they don't have to advertise. They don't have to raise funds. In fact, the editor there told me that any money that people send in through the donate button, you know, that's helpful. It might help with some travel or, you know, some minor expenses, but the big bucks are coming from likely out of state Democrats, you know, and I wish I had their names and numbers. I would call them.
I know you would. So tell us, Nancy, tell us about tell us about your organization, indepthnh.org, and that's a part of, it's under the umbrella of another organization.
Yeah, well, actually, it's one and the same because I haven't really fully developed what is called the New Hampshire Center for Nonprofit News. And when I started the center, it was with the hope that eventually we'll have an educational arm. I would really like to be able to train young reporters, and we are still aiming to do that once we really become financially stable as a news outlet. And the news outlet is indepthnh.org. And that's been our mission for the last 2 years, is to find a sustainable path to really make sure that we can build our business end. And, you know, Fanny Flagg, the writer, she wrote Fried Green Tomato. She said, every time I want to sit down and write, I realize the refrigerator needs defrosting. You know, and I'm the same way with fundraising. Every time I get really into fundraising, I realize there's a really good news story I have to get to. But I do embrace fundraising. It's a real art form, and there are professionals who do it way better than me. And that's our plan to become sustainable, is to be able to bring in enough money to hire professionals to do the job that they're excellent at. I'm a pretty good reporter. You know, fundraiser, so-so. But that's what our goal is to become self-sustainable. And as soon as we launched because I watched, as everybody watched in the nation, as the newspaper situation just got worse and worse. Every day there was another newspaper that was folding, more reporters gone. I checked with the state. The state says there well over 90% of all news jobs just disappeared in New Hampshire. Now, they're not counting in the handful of nonprofit news reporters that are filling some of the gaps, but even for indepthnh.org, our budget last year was $151,000. I feel we did some of the most impactful work of any news outlet that nobody can survive. None of the real news, the people who call themselves real newspapers could survive on that. We don't pay overtime. We are all contract workers. We get piecework, like we were sitting at a factory bench. But that's the only way we can survive. And the same way as you did, Alice, in Michigan, it's passion of people who can afford at the moment, because many of us at indepthnh.org are either retired or have a spouse that can handle the real income that you need to feed a family and get health insurance and all that. And passion can only go, we've been doing it on passion and pennies, I think we could say, for the last 8 years. And I'm really happy to continue doing that. But what we really need to do is bring in the younger generation, the new people. Where are they getting trained? I know there's some places like Report for America that go for a year to different places here and there. But when I look back at my career, I probably wasn't even much of a reporter for the first 5 years. What really helped was having really excellent reporters mentor me in the newsroom, people who really, knew their stuff, the Roger Talbots, the Nancy Mearsmans, at the Union Leader, that really showed us how to do it. And that's not happening anymore. If I were to go to, I was very lucky. We recently we were recruited by somebody who just got their master's degree from Columbia, and she looked at all the papers in New Hampshire and decided she wanted to work with us because she wants to become a really good reporter. And, you know, working with her and mentoring her, it's what we should be doing. And there's not that opportunity because I taught a couple of years ago kids who wanted to become investigative journalism at Boston University. And one kid said to me, my mother really doesn't want me to study journalism. And I said, just get a dual major, you know, just to satisfy her. Yes, the money is there now, but we're going to get through this hump. I know we are. I look at this as a real transition period. Now we're either going to go totally partisan news, like you're going to have you, as Alice said, your Democratic papers and your Republican papers, and try to sort through that, plus what the Russian bots are sending over. But what it means is we're going to really have to expect every reader to become savvy about what they're reading. You know, I think most of us have a gut instinct. Is this story fair? Is this story balanced? Do we get the other side? Do we get all the nuances to this story? Often there isn't time each day, so we have to get back to a story time and time again. But a lot is going to be expected from readers to just find the news outlets that you trust, not just the ones that say the same things you believe, but find out who you trust and support them. I would love it if people support indepthnh.org. I find it truly joyful. This is the best time. This is like Christmas every day because end of the year is a really good time for donations. So we probably get a lot of our donations this time of year. And we have one person who signed up to pay $3 a month to get indepthnh.org news. And I'm proud of that. We have someone else that signed up for $100 a month. And they're equal in my mind. They're people who care about the future of news, and they're giving what they can. More people give, you know, like one time here and there. I'll pay so many checks that aren't huge, but they really show that people care about getting the best they can get for real news and news they can trust, unbiased, nonprofit. You know, in the nonprofit world, I feel we're held to a higher standard. Maybe this is just my personal belief, but it's an ethical thing. We can't waste dollars. You know, we don't waste dollars, and we make sure everybody that donates to us, and even if people don't donate, we want our readers to get the very most that they can get. This is passionate old people doing news. We've got to train young people, middle-aged people, and there's a lot of new shiny object things people are touting. You know, we have one program that I've heard about that's starting up in New Hampshire where we're going to train local citizens to go to selectmen's meetings, to go to planning board meetings, to go and then call up a reporter and tell them what happened. I guess I'm not sure how it works after that, but you know what happens in the real world to people who've actually been to selectmen's meetings. Actually, I think I've actually been asked to leave a selectmen's meeting. But they're not some sort of nice place where you have some news secretaries taking notes and spitting it out. You know, and it's not for the faint-hearted. And it's also duplicative because most of these meetings now are on their local cable TV shows. You know, they can get the minutes to the meeting if people are that interested. We don't have, and I think the one good thing about this concept is that citizens will be trained to make right to know requests, to make demands of their government. You know, when people call me up and ask me to look into things, I'm really happy to do it. But I would be thrilled for people to just understand the government belongs to them. The records that the government keeps belongs to them. with some exceptions, of course, for juvenile records, and those are usually carved out in the law. And I think that's going away. I think there's actually becoming less interest in news. You know, people say, they're going to do what they want to do, so why should I care? You know, except with the exception of a small handful of, people who really just have it in their blood to care about what's going on. And I want to see that grow again. I want to see everybody. There's a picture that I used to use in a slideshow, and it's got a train of everybody heading into work in the probably in the 1960s, and everybody's got their newspaper open. Everybody wanted to know what was going on. And now I think it also could be that we've become more jaded about what government is doing and just go, yeah, that's government being government. And I'll tell you, government knows that we're at our weakest point right now because they don't fear a bad editorial in a major newspaper. Because
Right.
not everybody is reading the major newspaper like they did. And
No, they've lost circulation. Our biggest newspaper is not big at all anymore. And Alice had something she wanted to follow up on what you were saying, Nancy.
Yeah, so Nancy, you were talking about how, everybody wants to know what's going on. And I think that urge still exists even when news disappears. And what ends up filling that gap is misinformation or sometimes intentional disinformation on the part of nefarious actors. And so that's why it is so important, I believe, that we have high quality nonpartisan news, because if we don't have that, people will still be seeking, but what they'll be consuming will very often be things that are either misinformation or disinformation or just random rumors in some circumstances. And that can get really dangerous.
Right.
Nikki Usher has a book out called News for the White, Rich, and Blue, which follows the data and really shows that where local news is being rescued is in places like East Lansing that tend to be white majority, tend to be upper in terms of the middle class, and then also tend to vote Democratic. And that's because where local news is being rescued, it's being rescued often by people who are politically left of center because they see it as a public service more than folks right of center do. The consequence of that, though, is further division in our nation, which is a terrible problem, right? Where you have a situation where there's this informational disparity, where populations that have more people of color, are poorer, and also are more right-wing leaning, are having trouble getting basic access to, in fact, what their government is up to. When we do the kind of news that we do, part of what we're doing is that media literacy you're talking about, Nancy. We're teaching people how to understand news, how to understand information, and why they should understand themselves to have the right to open government. That's one of the most critical things that news does, is it teaches people the right to open government.
Yes.
Oh, totally agreed. In New Hampshire, a lot of people just look at us as, an all lily white state where everybody's above average and, no problems. What we have in New Hampshire is a real class division. It's the haves and the have-nots. So you have a lot of people who really can't afford to pay for the paywalls for a lot of the for-profit news outlets right now. There's very few news outlets that are statewide that really cover any issues seriously that are free. And we're one of them. New Hampshire Public Radio has a website that it's free to open to the people. I'm trying to think of others that I'm sure there's ones I'm not thinking of, but most of the for-profit dailies are behind paywalls.
Right.
And they're prohibitive for a lot of people to get even the basic news there. So I agree. What we just got to keep doing is, for me, is keep putting one foot in front of the other. And that's why I'm glad we're getting together tonight. I'm so delighted. Alice, you put it together so understandably what has happened in like the last 30 years with news.
Yeah. So I have a follow-up on that also that came from our chat. Don Jones is asking, what are your top volunteer needs? Are you both in positions to accept volunteers? And if you get them, do you know what you would do with them?
Well, for me, volunteering in the news business, it's a horse of a different color. And I think volunteers are a great idea. And I'm looking at Beverly Stoddard as one of our best volunteers. And Bob Charest is a
Yeah.
great volunteer.
Yeah.
But Bev and Bob are both very experienced news people. Bob has worked for 30 years in the every news outlets, from Lawrence Eagle Tribune, special sections editor at the Union Leader. It's hard to explain the concept, some of the concepts. We're very open to volunteers, and I always say, yes, come on board. But I don't think that it can be the only salvation. We have a couple of volunteers, and Bev and Bob, they've pretty much worked full time for us, I think, and for zero pay. And we are just so grateful for that. But there's not many people who can do that. Many of the people who volunteered, really well-intentioned, found that they just had to get some real paying work. I mean, I understand that.
Mm-hmm.
And even the people who are reporters, our reporters are making easily half of what they would at even a low-paying newspaper.
Right.
We're all probably averaging, when you figure it out piecework wise, right around low 30,000s a year. This is really not enough to, sustain a family or even one person in New Hampshire. Cost of living is so high and whatever. But yes, give him our number, because if he wants to volunteer, I'd love it.
All right, Montana, you were replying to Alice. Do you need volunteers in Michigan?
Well, I'm not working at East Lansing Info now because I've handed off the reins to work on this book project, but also because I'm burned out as heck. But over the years, I've talked to many news organizations, and people use volunteers for different things. Some of them have volunteer reporters and editors. Some of them use them for proofers. Some of them use them for bookkeepers. So there's actually a lot of different things people will use volunteers for to make this system work. In our case, we've had volunteers write thank you letters that are handwritten thank you letters to individual donors so that they get that we really are trying to make that connection. In addition, when we do our annual mailing, where we send out thousands of letters to people who've given in the past in the hopes that they'll give again, we actually handwrite on the envelopes because we know that the open rate will be higher. So we use volunteers for all sorts of things, but it can be difficult to use volunteers sometimes in the most core activities of reporting, because obviously those are special skills that people have to have had developed and bring.
Hope Damon is saying legislation proposed at New Hampshire State House included requiring municipalities to live stream and record publicly posted meetings. She wants to know your thoughts on that. I saw two.
Good.
Yeah.
Great idea.
You love that, huh?
They're not required now, but many of the State House meetings since COVID brought it all home, how much more involved and engaged citizens can be, because you can just go to YouTube and watch a committee meeting. So it's wonderful. I go on a lot of those meetings and see, oh my God, there's over 100 people just listening. If there are, usually the people who are listening can't speak up like they could possibly if they were in person at the meeting, but it really helped get us through COVID. And I think it's the future to keep people engaged.
Everything that improves access to the government is a good thing. And, part of what's great about when meetings are broadcast and recorded and people in a community can look at it for themselves is that they function as a check then on the news. We have to have all these checks and balances in our world. If you've got people who are actually able to read my council report and watch the city council themselves, then they can write to me and say, I think you didn't actually bring a reasonable sense of what happened at this meeting because you spent all this time talking about this, but this other significant thing happened and you're just not interested in it, but we're interested in it. And that kind of check and balance of the public telling us what we're getting right and what we're getting wrong is so critically important too.
Yeah.
I do think it's unfortunate that it's going to have to be mandated. For me, I would prefer to see the people who run the meeting say, we can't wait to do that. That's not going to happen with certain groups.
If we have to mandate, we have to mandate it. We'll just say more thing on the issue of volunteers is that a surprising number of organizations that I'm talking to for the book that I'm working on, their top CEO is actually the volunteer in the organization. So it's the person running the business side, because they recognize that the journalists need to be freed up to do the work they're doing. So people like me and Nancy should not have to be dealing with the business side of things. And so at a lot of these organizations, volunteers turn out to be people in business who have retired, who know how to run a small business or a corporation. And they come in and actually deal with that, which is really great.
Yeah, I should have added on to the volunteers, the fact that our board of directors does wonders for us. Our treasurer, the treasurer of our board of directors, Gina Gilmore, she's a COO at a large satellite phone company. She does all of our bookkeeping. She keeps us honest. She does our billing. She does, makes sure the numbers add up. I really could not do that. I just don't have the skill to be able to keep us out of jail. Just the jail for stupid people.
Somebody needs to,
thieves,
right? All right, so Marie Morgan, what people are needed? Examples: bookkeeper, graphic designers, lawyers, tax people. What kind of volunteers do you need?
What do? Call me up. We need it.
There you go.
We've used all of those things. We've used volunteer graphic designers. We've used a pro bono attorney. We've used pro bono accounting. We've used all of those things over the course of the life of East Lansing Info, and they've all been very, very helpful.
Oh, Alice, you're reminding me. We also have a pro bono attorney who's fought a very long battle to get our Lori list in court. It's still in court, hasn't budged, but we're the only news outlet still fighting. There were 6 of us, 6 news outlets when we began, and ACLU. They've all dropped off and accepted a hodgepodge new law that is really not going to satisfy the needs of the convicts who are serving time in jail when they did not know or have the information that the cop who testified against them had a personnel file filled with, lies and deceitful actions. So yes, and Andrew Valinsky has been wonderful to do that. So I'm remembering all these wonderful people, but like Alice said, there's all sorts of things that can be done that can be helpful. You know what? Have your friend sign up for our free newsletter. That helps us. Tell them that you read an honest, legit newspaper.
Yes.
That helps us. That is, wonderful. Share our stories on Facebook, although I hate Facebook. It's a necessary evil. And Twitter, hate that too, but necessary evil. We use those things. Repost, and we get more readers. And the more readers we get, the more people will see.
Okay, to that point, InZane 12,000 is saying, could volunteers help post stories to your social media accounts?
Oh boy, could we use that? Yes, that is.
That's enthusiastic.
Get that guy's number, seriously. After I post every single story that we post every day, I joined, I'm not even sure this is legal, so I shouldn't say it publicly, but I joined a whole bunch of Facebook pages. And when they say, why do you want to belong to this page? I say, because I tell them the truth, and we've been booted out of a couple, but I try to share to as many different groups as I can, just so we can get some notoriety. We didn't come in with a $500,000 budget like one particular group I know, and we don't have money for advertising. We don't, even if we had more money, I wouldn't wait. See, I'm like, we'd have to do more stories, no advertising.
Yeah.
But and I want to thank everybody that showed up tonight, because just showing up and getting to know us better, even if you don't like us, at least you know who we are.
Right.
It's hard to get that word out. Social media is not a be all end all. Facebook is really trying to do its best to get rid of local news, as far as I'm concerned.
And not let you get your posting to the amount of people that you have friends to,
unless you pay them.
Now let me just say that David Trumbull just wanted to say that your work is greatly appreciated, and this is actually could be for both of you. Your coverage of the State House issues and editorials on these issues keep us well informed. And that's
Thank
important.
you.
So let me ask you this. There's been a lot of talk about government having some role in funding news media. Why is this a good thing or is it not a good thing? Do we want the government giving us money or not?
I would refuse government money, and I can't see a world in which that would be successful from New Hampshire's point of view.
Okay.
There's been a proposal at the federal level, which is somewhat intriguing, which is basically to give us credits for the payroll taxes that we pay when we employ people. However, when you look at the budget sizes of places like In-Depth NH and East Lansing Info and so many other local news organizations, the amount of money that we would get back from these tax credits is so small, it would make almost no difference.
Mm.
So I think it would end up supporting places that are sort of the Gannett Gatehouse kinds of places that in many circumstances are bringing a little bit of good news, but in general are just bringing not very much news at all because they're really nowadays directed at the national corporate profit.
Mm.
So that's not, I don't think, going to be any kind of savior in terms of bringing news more in a more efficient fashion. I did have one of our readers who kept insisting he wanted to try to get our local government to pass a tax to support us. And I kept explaining I wouldn't take it. Like, you cannot have a government that would be giving one particular news organization to begin with, right? Why would they favor one news organization? They hated us the most because we were the most hard-hitting, difficult news organization for them. But even if for some reason they decided to shower us with money, I'm in the same position as Nancy. I don't want to have a fiduciary financial relationship with my government. I
Yeah.
want to be able to be totally independent. That's how I serve the people.
Okay.
Ethically, I think the way to go is to just say no to government money.
Yeah, yeah. Marie Morgan is asking, is advertising not allowed at a nonprofit?
It is allowed. You have to account for it differently in terms of the accounting because it counts as a for-profit income. So it makes your accounting a little bit more complicated. The challenge with it is trying to find the advertisers. And Lion Publishers, which is the local independent online news publishers, just did a long-term study where they gave money and support, actual coaching support, to a bunch of local news organizations that they chose for this study. And they were trying to help them hire people who could sell the ads. So these are basically ad salespeople at the news organizations. 50% of them didn't work at all. They couldn't find somebody who was good at it. It simply didn't work. The other 50% appear to have only raised enough money to pay for their own salaries. So that doesn't benefit the organization at all. So what that tells us is it's really hard to sell enough ads to make it worth it for it. I have run into some news organizations that have volunteers who sell the ads and who are very passionate about it and really good at it. In those circumstances, obviously, all the ad dollars they're bringing in benefits because they're working as volunteers. But it's worth remembering that the whole reason the news system collapsed was because advertising was no longer viable. So there's nothing magical now that makes advertising viable. The fact is, it is still a very low revenue stream, and it's never going to magically bring money in. At East Lansing Info, we had a really hard time getting any corporate sponsorships, local corporate sponsorships or ads, because we're doing really tough, hard-hitting news on the government, on whatever's going on around town. And a lot of local business owners actually came to me and said, I'm going to personally write a check to the organization to support the work you're doing, but I can't have my business name there out in front because you're hitting the government so hard and I don't want to get them ticked off at me. So I totally get that. Their names as individuals are listed on our sponsorship page, but it doesn't have the name of the business then associated with the controversial reporting we're doing. So that describes sort of all the challenges built in with ads.
And there are differences in what you can how you can advertise. Is the way it was explained to me is you can't have someone say, we make better donuts than the other guy, but they can talk about their donuts. But I tried at one point, probably months, to just recruit somebody that could sell ads and couldn't find anyone that was willing to do it. And actually we were doing commission only. So that's not really a big incentive. And I think a lot of, like you said, the reason newspapers are collapsing is because of advertising. So it's not a money. I think it's something we have to look at and try to incorporate, but it's like grants. Grants are very hard to get, but we still, like my father used to say, you can't play if you can't win if you don't play. So we apply for them, and once in a blue moon we get one. Not very often, and I often think perhaps it's a waste of time, but we have to do it. And then there's all sorts of other ways we're trying to bring in income. We've been really working to try to sell affordable obituaries. A friend of mine's family, husband died. She spent over $900 on an obituary, and it was just a fairly short obituary. I put one in for a friend not too long ago, and it was almost $500. And we are the home of the $99 obituary, and it can be as long as you want. And we really respect what people have to say. We work with legacy. We do it correctly. It's been a slow slog, but we've gotten some obituaries, but we want to be the go-to place so that if you want to know who died, you don't have to go behind a paywall. You don't have to. I'm probably more interested in this because of my age, because I know people who've died and I didn't know about it because it was only published in the Laconia, whatever, and I don't read that paper behind a paywall, whatever.
Okay,
And
so
I've had a lot
Marie,
of other people, so we've worked very hard. Oh, sorry. Beverly and I go to every meeting of the annual
we are.
Mortuary Society.
Yes, we know the funeral directors.
We do, and they seem to like us, but it's coming. We will be the home, and we want to make money in a way that is also a public service. Obituaries are a public service. In New Hampshire, it's a small state. Once anybody dies, it's news, I believe, and we want to be part of that. But put in the chat room any other ideas you have for making money.
Okay.
It's legal. It's
all right,
legal. Got to be legal.
Yeah, all right, no. Yeah, let's keep it legal. Marie Morgan again is asking, isn't PBS partly government funded, and is your outlet a daily? Do you consider your outlets a daily?
Well, I consider ours, as soon as the news is done that day, like when I get off tonight, we'll post on our free newsletter, sign up for our free newsletter. That's a volunteer situation that everybody can do. And I will post the news, whether it's at 7 o'clock or 2 o'clock in the morning, if it's a late night that I just couldn't seem to get the story done. We don't wait. We don't give you today's news tomorrow. We do it today.
We do.
Was that the question?
No, that's fine. How about the part of PBS getting government money, Alice? We've got 5 minutes left in our hour here, and I've got a couple of more comments in the chat that I need to go through.
Yeah, they do. And I assume you've seen the kinds of political pressure then that they're subject to. So PBS funding has been politically controversial, and they've been subject over and over again to sort of public criticisms and even attacks on their work of the sort that I think those of us who run independent news organizations would best like to avoid. I'm not saying PBS can afford to simply pull out of the situation it's in, because I think it would be very difficult for it to survive if it stopped taking the government funding. However, I think what's happened to PBS really shows what we're trying to avoid, a situation where politicians get to decide how much pressure to put on us. We don't like that situation. If we can.
I do know in New Hampshire, the government, the state government gives nothing anymore to public television, and stopped doing so maybe a decade ago, in which they were forced to cut some really good programs, news programs that they were doing. So New Hampshire pays nothing for PBS. And I don't know about New Hampshire Public Radio. I don't believe they give anything to them, but they also would get national money.
And there is obviously a lot of excellent reporting that happens at PBS and at NPR. These organizations do excellent reporting. However, like I said, if there's a way to avoid that kind of political pressure, I think all of us do try to avoid that. It's the very reason why we try very hard to remain independent of the governments.
Okay, how about would you be interested in a volunteer grants writer? And I would say, that's probably a big yes, right?
Yes, of course.
Yeah. And can you accept paid political advertising by candidates?
No, that is a big thing about a 501c3 nonprofit is that's absolutely forbidden. I mean, we would not want to do it anyway. Well, actually, you can take political advertising. You cannot endorse. I'm sorry, I misspoke. And this has actually been a controversial issue within nonprofit news about whether or not you should take political ads. Some people feel that as long as you're taking political ads that are honest, in other words, that don't lie within the course of the ad and make a misrepresentation, that it's acceptable if it's open to all equally to all candidates and all candidates can buy in. So there are some organizations that do that. And in fact, there are some organizations that I know that have put out voter guides where there's nonpartisan information, the voter guide, but then it's supported through political advertising as the way that they pay for that nonpartisan voter. I personally feel like that sends a mixed message, right? So you're providing a nonpartisan amount of information, but then on the bottom, there are these partisan ads that are trying to convince the voters to vote for them. So personally, I don't like the idea of taking political advertising. What we are strictly forbidden from doing is endorsing any political candidates or any ballot issues. So we're very much not allowed to do that. That would be a violation of our 501(c)(3) status. Again, to me, I'm not tempted to do that at all because I don't think my job is to tell people how to vote. My job is to get them the information that helps them vote in an educated fashion in a way that accords with their own values.
I could be open to it in certain circumstances, but I think it's fraught with possible problems. You know, if only the Democrats buy ads, it looks like we're favoring it's just best to do without it.
Okay, I've got a couple of kudos for everybody. Let's see, Rich Banishar, thank you for this conversation. I have learned much about your reporting and nonprofit status. I am truly impressed with everyone. Rich Banishar, and he's in Ohio. And let's see, I've got Marie Morgan has said, I am a subscriber and love it. And Kate Kuhn is saying, love In Depth NH, and this is a great program. Thank you. That's what we're hoping to accomplish tonight, don't you think, folks? Is give
Yes, and I want to let folks know that I think we need to get our message out more. I'm going to try to put something together. I'm not going to try. I'm going to put something together where we have a Zoom meeting at least once a month, maybe just a half hour, just a Q&A. I'll show up and maybe a kind guest like Alice, an expert, and Bev, and just ask us questions, you know? And I think that would be a part of our civic obligation to let people know how we're doing, what we're
I think,
doing.
Nancy, if you just open it up and let people ask you questions about the news, you will be flooded with interesting questions about the news.
And she will have such great stories to tell as well.
Yeah.
And we get great tips, you know, I get people that, you know, they don't feel like they're being heard anywhere and they call and at least we take a look at what they're complaining about. And there's so many people who feel they're being wronged and we need more reporters to open those phone lines even further. So anyway, watch indepthnh.org for more of these meetings and come show up. Don't we have any hecklers or anything?
You know what? We're at 7:01. Alice, when's your new book coming out and what's the title?
I can't tell you either of those things. I'm still in the research stage. I know the title, but I don't want to put it out there. And
got it. I get
exactly when it'll be published, but I'm interviewing Nancy in New Hampshire on Monday. I'm very excited about that.
We'll be in Plastow.
Yep. Should be.
I don't get to Plastow every day.
And Nancy, all right. So do you have any final thoughts, Nancy?
Yeah, thank you, Bev. Thank you, Alice. Thank you, Bob Charest. Thank you to Montana West, who is related. He's my son who pulls these Zoom meetings together for us. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Really, it does take more than, I can't wait for some of these volunteers to call. Thank you. 603-738, put my number in the chat, 5635.
Also, let me just say she'll need a volunteer coordinator.
Yeah. And there
right on. Right
That's
on.
a great suggestion. Yes, excellent.
Do you need any volunteers for your book?
No, no, no. I'm very deep into interviews. It's been great.
Okay. All right. So I am going to say thank you so much, Alice Dreger. It's
you.
been an honor to meet you and get to know you. I'm going to send you
Sure.
my book, and you're going to send me Galileo's Middle Finger. We're exchanging books. And Nancy West, I love you, Nancy. You know that, right? Whatever
Thank
Nancy
you.
wants is my motto. And so thank you
And
both
that's
for
a
being
good
here.
motto. Thank
It's
you.
a good motto. All right. And so we're going to say good night and thank you so very much. And we'll see you the next time, folks. Thank you
Thank
for
you.
joining us.
Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.
And we're